The moment I remember most clearly isn't the day I found out the truth. It isn't the courtroom, and it isn't the morning I stood in my father's empty office and watched Preston sign documents that bore a name I also deserved to carry. The moment I remember most clearly is a Tuesday afternoon in October of my senior year, when Preston Whitfield walked across the school parking lot with his arm around Caroline Davenport's shoulders, turned his head slowly in my direction, and held my gaze for exactly 3 seconds before looking away. 3 seconds. I have measured that look against everything that came after. Against 4 years of law school, against 2 failed relationships, against the 217 days I spent preparing a legal case that would eventually run for 11 months and generate coverage in 4 major national publications. Against all of it, those 3 seconds remain the most precise and deliberate act of violence I have ever experienced. Because he knew I would understand what he was doing, because he had made certain I would see it. I was standing near my car. I'd been waiting for Caroline. We had plans, nothing formal, just the kind of easy Tuesday afternoon that 2 people fall into when they've been circling something unspoken for several months. She'd left class 5 minutes before me. I came outside, expecting to find her by the east entrance, where we usually met. Instead, I found the parking lot, October sunlight, and Preston, with his hand on the small of her back, walking her toward his car. He looked at me. I looked at him. Caroline didn't look at me at all. I want to tell you I said something. I want to tell you I crossed the parking lot, put myself between them, demanded an explanation. I want to tell you I had the composure, even then, to recognize the situation for what it was. Calculated, premeditated, architecturally precise in the way only someone with advanced knowledge of what they're protecting can be. I said, nothing. I stood there until his car was gone. Then I sat in the driver's seat of my own car for 23 minutes without starting the engine. I didn't know yet about the DNA test. I didn't know yet about the will. I didn't know yet that the man dying slowly in Whitfield Manor, 3 miles north of that parking lot, had left a document in his study, unsigned, sealed, but written in plain language, that would have changed the legal and financial architecture of my entire life. I knew none of that. All I knew was that my closest friend for 6 years had just taken the girl I loved, done it publicly and deliberately, and looked me in the eye while he did it. That was the beginning. What came after wasn't revenge. I want to be honest about that. What came after was something slower, colder, and ultimately far more exhausting than revenge. It was the construction of a life, built methodically, on nothing but discipline and accumulated competence. In the shadow of an injustice I didn't fully understand until I was 31 years old. By the time I understood it completely, I had the tools to respond. I want to tell you that felt satisfying. I'm still figuring out whether it did. Preston Whitfield and I met in the 6th grade, which means we had 6 years of genuine friendship before he chose to destroy it. I want to give those 6 years their proper weight because it would be dishonest to reduce him simply to the person he became on that October afternoon. He was, for a long time, the best friend I had. He was funny in the quick, dry way that makes you feel clever for catching the joke. He was generous with his time in a way that wealthy kids sometimes aren't. He didn't use money as a substitute for presence. He showed up. He called back. For 6 years, he was the person I trusted most in the world after my mother. We met on the first day of 6th grade in a classroom where the seating was alphabetical. My last name put me 2 rows from the window. His last name, Whitfield, was all the way at the back. But the teacher assigned a group project in the 2nd week, and whoever designed the groupings had a sense of irony, because Preston ended up at my table with 2 other kids who spent most of the project period arguing about something irrelevant, and Preston and I ended up doing most of the work ourselves. We finished early. We had time to kill. He asked what I was reading. I told him. He said he'd read it already and that the ending was disappointing, which was the correct take. and we argued about it for 20 minutes with the kind of energy that people argue when they actually enjoy disagreeing, and by the end of the period, we'd made plans to continue the argument at lunch. 6 years of that. 6 years of the ongoing argument that is a genuine friendship, about books, about sports, about the school, and the teachers and the various dramas of adolescence. 6 years of being the person he called when something went wrong and the person he came looking for when something went right. 6 years of Christmas dinners at his house and summer afternoons, and a friendship that had the particular solidity of something built on genuine compatibility rather than convenience. I didn't understand, in those years, why his father looked at me the way he sometimes did. There was a quality to Charles Whitfield's attention that I noticed without being able to classify. At the Christmas dinner when I was 15, the year my mother worked a holiday shift, and Preston had insisted with real warmth that I come to his family's table instead of spending the evening alone, Charles Whitfield shook my hand and held it for a fraction of a second longer than was customary. He said Preston had spoken well of me. His eyes moved over my face with a particular focus. I registered it as the attention of a man being courteous. I filed it and moved on. I understand it now as the attention of a man who spent 17 years wondering whether the right thing to do was to say something. The Whitfield family was the kind of wealthy that doesn't announce itself loudly. No ostentatious displays, no constant references to money or connections. Charles ran a private equity operation that had grown over 30 years, from a small regional fund to one of the most respected mid-market investment platforms in the state. He wore unremarkable clothes. He drove a practical car. He had the particular quiet of men who have nothing to prove, because the proof is already filed somewhere in a building that bears their name. The Whitfield estate, the property, the portfolio, the operation, was everything that Charles had built across 30 years of careful, methodical work. Preston had grown up understanding that he would inherit it. It was his inheritance in the same way the furniture was his inheritance, the way the family name was his inheritance. It was the fixed axis around which his identity had organized itself from childhood. I understand now why that made what he found so terrifying. My mother, Valerie Langston, worked as a nurse practitioner at a hospital 40 minutes from the house we rented on the east side of town. She was competent and careful and slightly tired in the way of people who have been carrying their full weight alone for a long time. She had raised me by herself from the time I was 4. She never spoke about my father. I had learned early not to press the question. There was a quality to her silence on the subject. Not evasive exactly, but load-bearing, like a wall you don't want to push because you're not sure what it's holding up. I'd stopped asking by the time I was 12. By the time I was 17, I had constructed a version of myself that didn't need the answer. I was self-sufficient in the particular way of people who were trained early to expect nothing from absent parties. I had good grades. I had a plan. Not a fully formed one, but the outline of one. We talked about those futures easily, the way close friends do, as though they were already half real. Then October happened. Then everything I had constructed with such careful confidence began to come apart. The week before the parking lot, I had lunch with Caroline and 3 other people at a table near the south windows of the cafeteria. It was the kind of lunch that accumulates meaning in retrospect. At the time, it was ordinary, easy, the natural chemistry of 2 people who had been gradually drawing closer over the first weeks of senior year. She laughed at something I said. She passed me the hot sauce without being asked. When she left the table, she touched my shoulder briefly, the kind of contact that isn't accidental. I drove home that afternoon thinking about what to say to her. I was 17, and I was aware that I was overthinking it, and I couldn't stop overthinking it. That night, I typed a message and deleted it. Typed another version. Deleted that too, went to sleep. The next morning at school, Preston appeared at her locker before first period. I saw it from 30 feet away and didn't understand what I was seeing. They were talking. She was smiling. The slightly formal smile of someone in a conversation they hadn't initiated. He was leaning against the adjacent locker with the easy body language of someone who has nothing to prove and everything to offer, which was how Preston naturally occupied space when he chose to deploy it. I walked past. Neither of them saw me. By the end of that week, the parking lot, what I know now and didn't know then, is that the timeline of Preston's actions was running parallel to a timeline I had no access to. He'd had the information, the DNA results, the draft will, the full terrifying scope of what his father intended. For approximately 2 weeks by the time he showed up at her locker, 2 weeks during which he'd read and reread and calculated and made a decision. The decision was me. The mechanism was Caroline, and the execution was so precise that I spent 14 years understanding it as simple betrayal before I understood it as strategy. In the weeks after the parking lot, I tried twice to speak with Preston directly. The first time, I caught him in the hallway before first period on a Thursday morning. I put myself in his path, not aggressively, just in the way that communicates, I'm not going to let this pass without a conversation. He stopped. Around us, the hallway moved with the usual traffic of people heading to class, and I was aware of being watched by at least 4 people I recognized. I said quietly that I needed him to tell me what was happening. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite classify. Not guilty, not hostile, something more controlled than either. It was the expression of a man who is prepared for a meeting and knows exactly how long he's willing to let it run. He said that Caroline had made her choice and he wasn't going to apologize for it. He said it in the tone of someone reciting a sentence they've prepared in advance, tested for neutrality, and delivered with the flat authority of someone who doesn't expect to be challenged. I said that wasn't what I was asking. I said I was asking about him and me, about a friendship, about whether he understood what he'd done to something that had taken 6 years to build. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said that people change, that senior year has a way of clarifying priorities, and that he hoped I could eventually respect the situation. Then he walked around me and continued down the hallway. I stood there for a moment. The 4 people who'd been watching found other things to look at. The second conversation was worse. I'd called his cell phone from my car, late on, a Friday, and he picked up. I asked him point blank whether he'd gone after Caroline specifically, because he knew how I felt about her. There was a pause. 4 seconds, 5 seconds. And then he said carefully that feelings didn't entitle anyone to a person's time or attention, and that I should probably take some space and get some perspective. He was 17 years old and speaking like a man who had consulted a lawyer. I understand why now. At the time, the precision of it was more confusing than the betrayal itself. I knew Preston. I'd known him for 6 years. I'd seen him be petty and thoughtless in the normal, human ways that teenagers are petty and thoughtless. This was different. This had the texture of strategy. He wasn't acting on impulse or selfishness or even simple competition. He was executing something. I said his name, just his name, in the kind of voice that is asking someone to be real, to stop the performance, to be the person I'd known for 6 years. There was a silence. Then he said, "I'm sorry things feel this way for you." I've thought about that sentence many times since. The specific construction of it, feel this way for you, as though my understanding of the situation was a personal emotional malfunction rather than an accurate perception of a real event. It's the sentence you say when you want someone to believe their own experience is unreliable. It's a very controlled sentence. It's the kind of sentence a frightened person develops when they need to maintain a story. I hung up. Caroline, for her part, went nearly silent. She and I had been close enough that her withdrawal registered as a physical loss. There were conversations I expected to have that simply didn't happen. small exchanges and shared observations that fell into a void. I saw her in school. We were civil. She looked at me sometimes with an expression that might have been apologetic or might have been confused, and I didn't know enough yet to read it accurately. What I know now is that she was already beginning to wonder. There was an afternoon in early November. She told me this during a long conversation years later, in the specific, careful language of a witness who has decided to be completely honest, when Preston had taken her to the Whitfield house. Charles was home, upstairs, under the care of a hospice nurse who came every other day. Preston had wanted to see his father. She'd waited in the living room while he went upstairs. She'd heard voices, not words. The house was large, and the rooms were thick-walled, just the sound of conversation. And then, after a long silence, a different kind of sound. Something lower, slower, the quality of a voice losing its grip on structure. She'd moved to the foot of the stairs, not consciously, just drawn by the changed sound. The name she heard was mine, not Preston's name, mine. Said in the way you say a name when you're addressing someone who isn't in the room, when you're having the conversation in your head that you haven't been able to have out loud, when the medication has thinned the boundary between what you're thinking and what you're speaking. She told me that she'd stood at the bottom of those stairs and felt the hairs on her arms rise, though she couldn't have said why. She'd gone back to the living room. When Preston came downstairs, his face was carefully neutral in the particular way it was carefully neutral when he was managing something. She'd asked him what his father had said. He'd told her it was the medication, that his father sometimes confused names, that it meant nothing. She said she'd believed him. She said she'd wanted to believe him. Wanting to believe something, she told me, in that diner years later, is a very powerful engine. It runs on all kinds of fuel that you don't always recognize as fuel. By December, I was beginning to collapse. I want to be precise about what collapse looked like for me, because I think people have a flattened image of it. The visible breakdown, the dramatic fall. For me, it was quieter and more corrosive. It was waking up at 3 a.m. with a cold, specific dread that I couldn't name. It was sitting in class and finding that the information was landing somewhere outside me, rather than inside me, that I was watching myself from a slight distance, not fully present in my own life. It was the particular loneliness of watching a social world I'd built over 6 years reorganize itself around Preston. Naturally and without malice, because Preston was Preston Whitfield and I was the friend he'd apparently needed distance from. At lunch, the table shifted. Not dramatically. Nobody announced anything. But the composition of the group around me changed by small degrees over the weeks of November. The way a landscape changes season by season so you don't notice until you look at a photograph from before and can't quite believe the difference. The people who'd been easy with me became careful. The people who'd been neutral became absent. A boy named, I won't use his actual name, he doesn't deserve space in this story, who had been a peripheral friend for 2 years, found a reason to tell me, with the sympathetic tone of someone delivering necessary news, that I was coming across kind of intense lately, and that people had noticed. I asked him what people. He said just people. That was the shape of it. Not dramatic exile, not a formal rupture, just the steady, efficient mechanism of a social ecosystem reorganizing its energy toward the most powerful available node. Preston had resources, connections, the particular gravitational pull of someone who was going to a name-bearing university in 8 months. I was the friend who'd been left behind and couldn't accept it, which was the narrative Preston had established and which required no maintenance, because social narratives, once launched, run themselves. My grades held. I want to be clear about that. They held because I pushed them, because I had nothing else, because the only thing I could control with any precision was the work I put in front of me. I studied with a focus that was slightly alarming to people who'd known me before, not in a visible, desperate way, but with the quiet intensity of someone who has converted their excess emotional energy into something academic. My SAT scores were strong. My applications went out on time. From the outside, I was functioning. Inside, I was running on something I couldn't quite characterize. Not ambition exactly, not rage. Something colder and more fundamental. A refusal. I remember one night in particular, December, very late, sitting at the desk in my bedroom with an economics textbook open in front of me that I wasn't really reading. My mother had left a plate of food outside my door 2 hours earlier that I hadn't eaten. The house was quiet. Through the window, the streetlight lit the empty road with the particular flatness of December midnight. I thought about Preston in his house, 3 miles away, managing access to a dying man's final weeks, with the precision of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. I didn't know that's what he was doing, I just felt it, the way you feel a structural wrongness before you can name its shape. Something had been done to me that was larger than a girl, larger than a friendship, larger than high school social algebra. I sat at my desk at midnight, and I made myself a promise. I didn't articulate it clearly. 17-year-olds rarely do, and I was too tired and too raw to be eloquent. But the substance of it was, whatever has been taken from me, I am going to build something that cannot be taken. I am going to learn everything I need to know. I am going to be in a position someday where what was done to me can be responded to on terms I control. I turned back to the economics textbook. I read until 3 a.m. I made one strategic mistake in that period. In February of my senior year, at a party I should not have attended, I said something about Preston. The party was at Allison Prescott's house while her parents were away. The standard type, 40 or 50 people, varying states of sobriety. The loose social energy of a winter Saturday, with no particular agenda. I'd gone because Zachary Gibson, one of the 2 genuine friends I had left, had asked me to come, and I'd been saying no to things for months, and I thought going would be evidence of some kind of normalcy. It wasn't a good idea. The energy of a party like that, the particular mix of alcohol and ambient social comparison, was not an environment I was navigating well in that period. I had a beer and a half, which isn't very much, but I was running on sleep debt and emotional exhaustion and very little margin. At some point, standing near the kitchen with Zachary and 2 other people I trusted moderately, I talked about the parking lot, about the calculated quality of it. I didn't raise my voice. I was specific and controlled. I said that Preston had done something deliberate, not impulsive, not the result of normal human selfishness, but planned, timed, designed to produce a specific effect. And that I didn't know why, but I knew that whatever had motivated it was larger than competition over a girl. Zachary was listening carefully. The other 2 people were listening with the slightly widened focus of people receiving information they know is significant. I said one more thing. I said that Preston Whitfield was someone who protected his interests with the kind of precision that required advanced knowledge of something he wasn't supposed to know, and that someday I intended to understand what that something was. I said it quietly. I said it without drama. I said it to 4 people in a kitchen at a party. By Monday morning, it had traveled through approximately 3 iterations of social telephone and arrived at Preston in a form that characterized me as having called him a liar and a manipulator in front of half the senior class while visibly intoxicated. He handled the information with exactly the precision I should have anticipated. He didn't confront me. He didn't argue the characterization. He simply made himself available to the natural human instinct to choose a side. And the natural human instinct chose the side with more social leverage. And within a week, the narrative had settled into its final form. I was bitter. I was the friend who'd been left behind and couldn't accept it. Whatever Preston had done or not done was secondary to the fact that I'd made a scene. And scenes are embarrassing, and embarrassment is the one sin that high school culture doesn't forgive. I want to be honest. It was the right move on his part, strategically, not morally. I want to be absolutely clear about the moral accounting here, but strategically it was correct. He didn't need to fight me. He just needed the room to stop taking my side, and I'd given him the ammunition to make that happen. There was one afternoon in March when I came around a corner in the east hallway and nearly walked into Preston and Caroline and two other people. 4 feet of distance suddenly, between me and the center of everything that had reorganized itself without me. Preston nodded. Precise, minimal. The nod you give someone you once knew. Caroline met my eyes for a fraction of a second and then looked somewhere else. One of the other two people performed not having noticed me with the particular effort of someone who is definitely noticing. I nodded back, kept walking, turned the corner, and stood against the wall for 10 seconds breathing. Then I went to class. I finished out the year in a social condition that I can only describe as transparent. I was present and unacknowledged. I went to class. I ate lunch. I attended the graduation ceremony and shook hands and accepted a scholarship to a state university 4 hours away and left in August without a party or a farewell or any of the small ceremonies that mark the end of a chapter. I left in my car on a Wednesday morning with everything I owned in the back seat. My mother stood in the driveway and watched me go. I didn't know then that she was carrying something she'd carried for 17 years, and that in 6 weeks she would finally decide she couldn't carry it anymore. She'd watched me pull out of the driveway, and she'd watched the car until it disappeared around the corner, and then she'd gone back inside. And she'd sat at the kitchen table and looked at the coffee cup she'd been holding all morning, and thought about what it meant that her son was driving 4 hours away to build a future, and didn't know whose blood ran in his veins. She told me this later. Much later. She said she'd almost called me back that morning. Almost. Let me tell you what Preston actually found, because the story doesn't make sense without it. The details emerged much later. Partly through the legal proceedings, partly through things Caroline told me over the course of a very long, very difficult conversation in a diner 2 years before the trial. Some of it I've reconstructed. The core of it is documented. In early September of our senior year, approximately 6 weeks before the parking lot, Preston had gone into his father's private study to retrieve a book he'd borrowed. This is what he told his attorney, and I have no reason to disbelieve the detail itself. The study was locked, but Preston had a key. Charles Whitfield had trusted his son with access. Charles had been sick for several months by then. The diagnosis, a form of cancer that had been caught later than it should have been, which was a detail Charles had managed carefully, keeping the severity of the prognosis from most people around him, had been confirmed in late spring. By September, the illness had advanced past the point where the daily reality of it could be managed silently. Charles had begun working shorter hours. A hospice assessment had been scheduled. The household had taken on the particular hushed quality of a place where everyone understands that the clock is running. On the desk in the study, mixed with papers that a man in advancing illness hadn't organized carefully, was an open envelope from a medical genetics laboratory. The report was dated 3 months earlier. It contained the kind of language that is specific and unmistakable even to someone with no medical background. A confirmation of biological paternity. My name, Charles Whitfield's name. A percentage. The kind of percentage that doesn't leave interpretive room. Preston read it. He told his attorney later that he stood in his father's study for an unknown period of time, he said he didn't remember how long, holding the report. That the quality of the light in the room changed while he stood there, which is how he knew it had been more than a few minutes. That he sat down at his father's desk in his father's chair and read the document 3 times with the specific compelled attention of someone hoping that the next reading will produce a different result. It didn't produce a different result. Then he went through the desk further. He told his attorney he was looking for context. I understand what that means. He was looking for the document that would tell him what came next, what his father planned to do with the information, whether action had already been taken, whether there was any possibility that the report was informational rather than preparatory. He found the draft will. It was handwritten, not yet formalized, but it was in his father's handwriting, and it was dated 2 weeks after the DNA results. Charles had written it in the careful, deliberate hand of someone for whom the act of writing was itself a form of commitment, as though putting it on paper was the first real step toward making it true. It named me as a beneficiary. It described the division of the estate in terms that would have reduced Preston's share to roughly 40% of what the original will provided. There was also a letter attached to the draft will, unsealed. It was addressed to Preston. I never saw the letter. It was destroyed. When exactly is something the court spent considerable time establishing. What Preston told his attorney, and what his attorney later disclosed in discovery, was that the letter explained the situation, that it asked for Preston's understanding, that it expressed Charles Whitfield's guilt in language that Preston described, under oath, as very direct, that it outlined Charles's intention to speak with both his sons before he died, that it expressed something, and Preston said this with a particular flatness, the flatness of someone reciting a sentence they have rehearsed for years, that he could only describe as love for a son he had not known how to acknowledge. Preston had approximately 3 weeks between reading those documents and taking any action. 3 weeks. I've thought about those 3 weeks a great deal, about what it means to sit with information like that, information that reorders the world, that changes the weight and meaning of everything around you, that announces that the stable architecture of your inheritance and your identity is not what you believed it to be, for 3 full weeks before responding. I think about the dinners during those 3 weeks. Charles at the head of the table, Preston across from him, the illness visible in Charles's face and the knowledge visible in Preston's, and neither of them saying anything. I think about what that required, the sustained performance of ordinary family life while the mechanism of a response was being designed. He was 17 years old. I don't know how to account for that fully. 17-year-old boys are not supposed to be capable of that kind of sustained, cold calculation. But fear of loss is a particular accelerant, and what Preston faced was a total loss. Not just money, but the identity that the money anchored, the story of himself as the Whitfield heir, the future he had organized himself around. What he did in response to that fear was monstrous. It was also, in some fundamental sense, the action of a terrified child protecting everything he'd been told was his. Both of those things are true simultaneously. I've spent years with the discomfort of that. In the first week of October, he identified the mechanism, Caroline, my one visible vulnerability, the thing that could be used to generate enough pain, enough confusion, enough public rupture to push me away from the Whitfield household in the exact window before Charles could speak to me, before the new will could be formalized, before the truth could surface through any channel he couldn't control. I want to describe how methodical this was, because it matters for understanding what followed. He didn't simply ask Caroline out. He built it over 10 days. He began appearing in her vicinity in ways that seemed natural. The shared class where he'd always sat at the far end of the room, and now sat 3 seats closer. A question about a shared assignment that could have been texted but was delivered in person. A conversation at lunch that ran longer than a brief exchange had any reason to run. Each individual step was completely plausible. Each one, viewed in isolation, was the ordinary behavior of a boy pursuing a girl. The sequence was the tell. The precision of the sequence, the timing of each step, the exact week in which he accelerated from proximity to declaration, that was not ordinary. That was a schedule, and the schedule was designed to conclude before the last week of October, because, by his own internal calculation, that was the window he had. He used her. She wasn't a participant. She was an instrument. He pursued her with the specific warmth and attention that he was capable of when he chose to deploy it, told her things about me that weren't exactly lies but were framed to create distance, that I was going through something, that I'd been pulling away from people, language carefully chosen to preemptively characterize my eventual distress as pre-existing dysfunction rather than reasonable response, and made himself present in her life in the weeks when I was most needed to be absent from his father's. He was 17 years old, and he executed this with the cold accuracy of someone much older. I've thought about that a great deal, about what it means for a 17-year-old to be capable of that calculation. Whether it says something about him specifically, or about what fear does to people, or about the particular moral education that comes from growing up with the kind of money that always has something to lose. I don't have a clean answer. I have a complicated one. What I know is that it worked. He created the rupture. I left. Charles Whitfield spent his final weeks in a fog of medication and grief, calling a name that Preston heard and answered for, managing access to a dying man's bedside, with the efficiency of someone who understood that time was the variable being managed. Charles tried to speak to me directly at least twice in those final weeks. Preston told his attorney, in the flat, controlled language of depositions, where every sentence has been rehearsed for minimum exposure, that his father had mentioned wanting to reach out to me, but that he had been concerned about his father's capacity to have difficult conversations given the stage of his illness. The question of whether Charles had been given access to a phone, or whether the hospice nurse had been instructed in any way about visitors, was an area of discovery that Preston's attorneys fought hard to keep narrow. My father died on a Wednesday in early November. I didn't know he was my father yet. I was in my first semester at university when my mother called. It was a Saturday morning, early enough that I was still half asleep, and the quality of her voice when I answered, a careful, measured quality, the voice of someone who has rehearsed an opening, brought me fully awake almost immediately. She said she needed to tell me something about my father. I said I didn't have a father. She said that wasn't entirely true. I want to describe the next 20 minutes with the precision they deserve, because they were the 20 minutes that reoriented everything. My past, my future, every memory I'd filed under the wrong heading. She told me his name. She told me the shape of what had happened. A relationship that was real and not brief. Two people who had not found a way to bridge the distance between their lives. A pregnancy she had managed to explain to the world without explaining to him. A silence she had maintained for 17 years out of a complicated mixture of pride and protection and fear of precisely the disruption that was, it turned out, coming anyway. She said she'd found out about his illness, that she'd heard it through someone who'd known both of them, a mutual connection from years ago, that the information had landed with a weight she hadn't anticipated, not because she expected anything from him, not because she thought the knowing changed anything between them, but because she understood what it meant for me. She said she'd been sitting with the question for 3 months, whether to tell me, what telling me would do, what not telling me would cost. She said she'd watched me drive away in August, and she'd thought about what it meant that her son was driving 4 hours away with a future and a plan, and no idea who he was built from. She said she was sorry. She said it simply and without excessive qualification, the way people apologize when they know the scale of what they're accounting for and have stopped trying to manage it. I held the phone. I said, "What's his name?" She said, "Charles Whitfield." I sat on the edge of my dorm bed and held the phone and felt the entire architecture of my life reorder itself around a new, load-bearing fact. Preston's face in the parking lot. The 3 seconds of eye contact. The calculation I'd sensed but hadn't been able to explain. The dinner at Christmas when I was 15, A handshake held a half-second too long. A sentence about Preston speaking well of me delivered with a quality I hadn't known how to name. I thought about the parking lot. The 3 seconds. He knew. He'd known for 6 weeks before that parking lot. And every day of those 6 weeks, while we'd still been nominally friends, he'd known what I didn't. And he'd been building toward a moment that would remove me from the picture with maximum efficiency. I thought about the dying man in a house 3 miles from where I'd grown up, saying my name in the dark to no one. And then I stopped thinking about anything, because I was already pulling on my jacket and finding my keys and running for the car. 4 hours. I drove 4 hours in, slightly over 3.5. I'm not proud of the speed. I was not calculating risk in that car. I was thinking about a word, son, and about whether I would get there in time to say it, or hear it, or just be in the same room as the man who'd wanted to write it into a legal document. My mother had said he was at Whitfield General. I knew the hospital, a large, well-funded regional facility, the kind with a private wing for families of significant means. I pulled into the parking structure at 2:07 in the afternoon. I ran from the parking structure to the main entrance, through the lobby, to the elevator, to the 4th floor, where my mother had said he was. The hallway was wide and pale-lit and quiet the way hospital hallways are quiet, a specific quiet that is the presence of controlled distress, rather than the absence of sound. A nurse at the station looked up when I came off the elevator. I said his name, Charles Whitfield. I said I was, and then I stopped, because the word I needed to say was the word I hadn't said yet, the word that had no official documentation behind it, the word that existed in a draft will that I didn't know had already been destroyed. I said I was a family friend. She looked at me with the particular, careful expression of someone who has delivered this information many times and has learned there is no way to deliver it softly. She said he'd passed at 1:53. I looked at the clock on the wall behind her. 2:07, 14 minutes. I stood in the hallway for what I think was a long time. A nurse asked me if I needed to sit down. I said no. I walked to the window at the end of the hall, a wide window overlooking the hospital's east courtyard, where the afternoon light was the flat gray of early November, and I stood there until the light changed. Preston was somewhere in that building. I didn't look for him. I didn't want to find him. Not yet. Not in that hallway, 14 minutes too late, with nothing I could say that wouldn't be either too large or completely beside the point. I drove back to my dorm that night. I don't remember the drive. In the weeks that followed, I tried twice to pursue the question of my paternity through official channels. Both times I was told, politely and firmly, that I had no standing, no documented claim, no legal recognition, no acknowledged relationship. The estate was in probate and moving through the standard processes. Preston had legal representation. The will, the original will, the one that gave Preston everything, was filed and uncontested. The draft will was gone. My mother retained a lawyer briefly. He was a general practitioner in estate matters. Competent, earnest, not specialized enough for the specific complexity of what we were facing. He spent 3 weeks examining the situation and reported back that without documentation of paternity, documentation I didn't have access to because the DNA results had been in Charles's study and were now missing, there was no viable angle of pursuit. He was apologetic. He said he was sorry for the situation. He said if anything ever surfaced, documentation, a witness willing to speak, to call him immediately. I thanked him and put his card somewhere I could find it. I was 18 years old. My father had died 14 minutes before I could reach him, and the law had no interest in my grief. I went back to university. I enrolled in every economics and business course the first-year curriculum offered. And then I did the thing that I think people who haven't been through a particular kind of institutional injustice don't fully understand. I got very quiet and I got very serious, and I started building. I want to be honest about those 13 years, because the narrative logic of a story like this is to compress them, to give you a montage of discipline and sacrifice, to imply that I spent every waking moment preparing for a confrontation I didn't yet know was coming. That's not quite accurate. Life is more lateral than that. I went sideways sometimes. I went wrong. I lost time to things that didn't serve the larger purpose, and I lost people to the version of myself I was building, and I made decisions that looked right in the moment and turned out to have costs I hadn't fully modeled. The first year of university was a controlled disaster. I passed everything. My grades were strong by any conventional measure, but I was operating in a dissociated mode, doing the work precisely without being fully present in my own life, which is sustainable for a year and starts to accumulate damage after that. I made one real friend that year, Elijah Montgomery, who was studying finance on a partial scholarship and who had the particular combination of intellectual rigor and human warmth that I'd stopped believing was possible after Preston. Elijah had a way of calling things directly, not unkindly, but without the hedging that most people use to avoid friction. We studied together constantly. We argued about everything. He is still, all these years later, one of two people I trust without reservation. He was the one who, sometime in the spring of first year, looked at me across a library table at 2 a.m. and said, "You study like you're trying to win a war." I said I wasn't sure that was wrong. He said there was a difference between building something and building armor, and that he'd been watching me for 8 months, and he couldn't always tell which one I was doing. I didn't have a good answer. I told him I'd think about it. He nodded and went back to his notes. I thought about it for several years. After university, I went to law school. The decision wasn't romantic. I'd spent 4 years studying finance, had interned at 2 investment firms, had worked enough to understand the architecture of capital, and I'd watched, from a careful distance, the Whitfield estate continue to grow under Preston's management. He'd graduated from a name-bearing university with an MBA. He'd stepped into his father's operation at 24, and, to his credit, had not destroyed it. He was competent, in the way people who inherit well-run machinery can be competent at running it. I went to law school because I understood, in some inchoate but persistent way, that the conflict between Preston and me was going to be resolved through legal mechanisms or not at all. I didn't know what those mechanisms would look like. I didn't have documentation. I had a story my mother had told me, and a set of memories I couldn't file in any court. But I'd spent enough time around investment and estate law to know that what can be documented eventually tends to surface, that people carry secrets at a cost, that old attorneys with long memories and deteriorating moral comfort have a way of making phone calls. Law school was different from university in a specific way. It demanded not just intelligence, but a particular kind of patience with complexity, with the grinding, methodical work of building an argument one piece at a time, with the discipline of following a thread without knowing where it leads, and the composure to sit with uncertainty long enough to find the path through it. I was not exceptional in my first year. I was too angry, and anger is a poor study partner because it makes you impatient with the precise, grinding work of legal reasoning. My professors noted that I was thorough but occasionally uncharitable in my analysis, meaning I saw what was wrong with an argument before I fully understood what was right about it, which is a useful skill in litigation but a deficiency in legal thinking broadly. I worked on that. By my second year, I had learned to use the anger differently, to channel it into the kind of meticulous attention to detail that good litigation requires. My moot court arguments improved substantially. My grades moved into the range that generated attention from the people whose attention mattered. There was a professor, a contract specialist, the most demanding person in the building, who called me into his office in February of my second year and told me I had the potential to be an exceptional litigator if I learned to separate my analysis from my investment in the outcome. He said the best trial lawyers he'd known were the ones who could hold simultaneously the full force of their conviction about their client's case, and the complete, unsentimental ability to see the opposition's strongest arguments. He said I was strong on conviction and needed to work on unsentimental. I wrote it down. I worked on it for the rest of law school. I clerked for a federal judge after graduation, a 2-year position that was among the most formative experiences of my professional life. The judge was meticulous, demanding, and profoundly fair in the specific way of people who have spent decades immersed in the mechanics of justice and understand the gap between justice and outcome. He asked more of his clerks than any of us expected, and he gave more too. Access to his thinking, his framework, his understanding of how institutions operate and where they fail. I learned in those 2 years how courts actually work. Not the theoretical mechanics, but the human reality, the weight of institutional inertia, the places where procedure serves justice and the places where it obstructs it, the specific ways in which documentation and testimony interact with judicial temperament to produce decisions that are never entirely predictable. I joined a mid-sized firm that did primarily commercial litigation and estate work. I spent 3 years there, learning the specific vocabulary and procedural landscape of exactly the kind of dispute I might, someday, find myself involved in. I took estate cases specifically. I learned the standards for contesting wills, the legal frameworks for establishing paternity and inheritance disputes, the procedural mechanisms available when bad faith in estate administration could be documented, but not proven with direct evidence. I was not thinking about Preston constantly. I want to be clear about that. I was building a career that would have been worth building regardless. I was doing work that mattered to clients who weren't my father's estate. I had colleagues I respected, and a couple of friendships that didn't have anything to do with the history I was carrying, but I was paying attention. I read the business press. I followed the Whitfield Group's publicly available developments. I tracked the names of people who'd worked for or with Charles Whitfield in the final years of his life. I maintained a mental inventory of who knew what, and who might have reasons to eventually say what they knew. Jonathan Mercer had been Charles, Whitfield's primary estate attorney for 11 years before Charles's death. He had retired from practice 4 years after, at 62, citing health and a desire to spend time with his grandchildren in a coastal state I won't name here. I had identified him early as a person of interest. He was too well positioned to the facts to be uninformed about the irregularities in the estate administration. I filed his name in the back of my mind, and I waited. During those years, I had 2 serious relationships. The first was with a woman I'll call Melanie. Not her real name, but she deserves the protection of it. She was smart, direct, and patient in ways I consistently under-rewarded. We were together for almost 2 years. She knew the general shape of the history I was carrying. I'd told her early, in the way you tell someone important things when you're deciding whether they're going to matter to you, and she'd received it with the care it deserved, but she was perceptive, in ways I wasn't fully prepared for. About 6 months before the end, she said something that I've thought about many times since. She said that she felt like she was in a relationship with the version of me that was present between the work and the preparation, and that version of me was wonderful, but that she wanted the whole version, and she wasn't sure the whole version had room for her. I told her she was wrong. I said that she was the most important person in my life, that the work was just work, that I was fully present. She looked at me for a moment and said, very gently, that she noticed I'd just listed 3 claims, and none of them had been about her specifically. They'd all been about correcting her perception of me. We lasted another 6 months after that. The ending wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and sad and mutual, and I drove home from the last conversation in her apartment and sat in my parking lot and understood that she had been completely right. The second relationship ended because I ended it, for reasons I'm not entirely proud of. She was beginning to ask the same questions Melanie had asked, in different language, And I had learned. I tell myself I'd learned, but I think the honest word is decided to move before that conversation could reach its conclusion. These are the things I do not tell people at work. These are the costs of the years of building that don't appear in a professional record. By my early 30s, I had built something real. An independent practice, small but respected, operating in the intersection of commercial litigation and estate dispute. A reputation for meticulous preparation. A record of winning cases that larger firms had passed on as insufficiently certain. 2 associates who were excellent and who trusted my judgment and worked harder for me than I probably deserved. I wasn't wealthy, I was solvent and growing. I had the professional architecture that would allow me, if the right documentation surfaced, to mount the kind of legal challenge that the Whitfield estate would not be able to simply dismiss. I was 31 years old when my phone rang on a Tuesday in March. The number was out of state. I almost didn't answer. Jonathan Mercer's voice was older than I expected, raspy and deliberate, the voice of a man who has been rehearsing a conversation for years and is choosing his words with the care of someone who understands the legal implications of each one. He said my name first, my full name. Then he asked if I had a moment. I sat down. I said I did. He said he'd been carrying something for 13 years and that the carrying of it had become incompatible with the remainder of his life. He was 75. He had been through a cancer diagnosis and a recovery and a great deal of time in a coastal house with his grandchildren, and whatever calculus he'd done about loyalty and professional obligation and personal accountability had come out differently than it had. At 62, he paused. I didn't fill the silence. I understood that this was a man who needed to say what he was going to say at his own pace, and that interrupting him would break something that he'd worked very hard to bring to this point. He said he had a copy of the DNA results. I was quiet for a long moment. He said he'd had it for 13 years, that Charles Whitfield had given him a copy in the final months of his life, along with explicit instructions about the draft will, and the letter and his intentions regarding both his sons. That Jonathan had been present in multiple conversations in which Charles had expressed his determination to correct the situation before he died. He said he'd known, in the days after Charles died, that something had happened, that the draft will wasn't where it should have been, that the letter wasn't where it should have been, that certain documents he had been told would be in a specific file were not in that file. His voice changed slightly when he said this, tightened. The voice of a man revisiting a decision he's been revisiting for 13 years. He said he'd told himself, at the time, that he couldn't prove what he suspected. That suspicion wasn't documentation, that the estate had proceeded through proper legal channels according to the filed will, and that his discomfort with the outcome didn't constitute actionable evidence. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I was wrong to tell myself that, and I knew I was wrong when I was telling myself. That's the part I've been living with. I wrote 4 things down while he talked. Then I put the pen down and just listened. He said he had the DNA results, notarized at the time of testing, with Charles Whitfield's name and mine both clearly identified. He said he had contemporaneous notes from his own files, notes he'd made during his meetings with Charles in the final months, that described the draft will, the letter, and Charles's explicit instructions. He said he had been present when Charles had told Preston, directly, about the planned changes to the estate. I wrote the last part down twice. He had been present. He had witnessed Charles Whitfield tell Preston Whitfield that there was a second son, that his name was on a new will, and that Preston needed to understand that this was not a matter Charles was willing to leave unresolved. I asked him when that conversation had taken place. He said it had taken place in late August of our senior year of high school, approximately 6 weeks before the parking lot. There was a long silence between us. I looked out the window of my office. The street below was ordinary. Midday traffic, a woman walking a dog, nothing significant. I was aware of the ordinary quality of the world outside, while something massive was rearranging itself inside. I said, "Mr. Mercer, I need you to understand that what you've just told me has the potential to become a significant legal proceeding. I need you to have independent counsel before we speak further." He said he'd already retained an attorney. He said he'd retained her 3 months ago in preparation for this call. I said, "Then I'll be calling you back." I hung up the phone. I sat in my office chair for approximately 10 minutes without moving. Then I called Elijah. Elijah came to my office that evening. He brought food, the kind of practical, sustaining food you bring to someone who is about to spend several hours in a state of high cognitive demand. He sat across the desk and listened while I walked through everything: the phone call, Jonathan Mercer's account, the documentation he claimed to have, the legal landscape, the procedural mechanisms available. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me what you're feeling." I said I was calculating strategy. He said, "That's what you're doing. Tell me what you're feeling." I looked at him for a moment. Elijah has always had this specific quality, a patience with discomfort that most people don't have, a willingness to stay in an uncomfortable question until it gets answered honestly. It's why I trust him. I said I didn't know. I said I'd been waiting for something like this for 13 years. And now that it was here, it didn't feel the way I'd expected. I'd expected clarity, momentum, the specific satisfaction of the machine finally having all its parts. What I actually felt was something closer to grief. He nodded. He said that made sense. He said, "Build the case, do it right, and also, take care of yourself through this, not after, through it." I said I would. I meant it. I wasn't entirely successful. I spent 48 hours doing nothing except reading and rereading every piece of documentation that Jonathan Mercer had agreed to provide. I pulled every case I could find involving contested wills, destroyed documents, and bad faith estate administration. I contacted 3 colleagues whose judgment I trusted, one specializing in estate litigation, one in civil fraud, one who had done academic work on the legal standards for establishing paternity in inheritance disputes. Then I called my mother. She didn't speak for a long moment when I told her about Jonathan Mercer. When she did speak, her voice had a quality I hadn't heard in it before. Not exactly relief, not exactly grief, but something that contained elements of both. The release of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. She said, "I always believed someone knew." I said someone had. She was quiet again. Then she said, "Will this be public?" I said yes. I said it was going to be a public proceeding, that it would generate press, that everything we'd held privately for 17 years was going to become part of a public record. She said, "Okay." Just that. Okay. The word of someone who has done the accounting and decided the cost is worth the paying. I told her I was going to need everything she knew and remembered. I told her I needed dates, conversations, names, anything that could corroborate the account. She said she'd been ready for 13 years. She said that wasn't entirely true, that she hadn't been ready exactly, but she'd been prepared, which was different. We filed the claim 7 months later. Those 7 months were among the most demanding of my professional life. Every document gathered, every witness located and interviewed, every procedural mechanism identified and stress-tested. Dominic Sterling, the former federal prosecutor I retained as lead counsel, ran the preparation with the thoroughness of someone who has seen cases fall apart on small omissions and has no patience for small omissions. He was the right choice. He was methodical in the way that good litigators are methodical. Not showy, not dramatic, but relentlessly organized and capable of holding an enormous factual record in his working memory while making each individual point seem simple and clear. He also had the specific quality of absolute composure under pressure, which I knew would matter because Preston's legal team would be expensive experienced and aggressive. We had lunch the week before filing. He said, "I've reviewed everything 3 times. We have a strong case. I want you to understand that a strong case isn't the same as a certain case. The other side is going to throw everything they have at Jonathan Mercer's credibility and at the chain of custody on the documentation. We need to be ready for that." I said I was ready. He said, "Good. One more thing. You're going to be in that courtroom as a party, not as an attorney. I need you to be able to sit at that table and remain controlled regardless of what happens." "Can you do that?" I said. "I've had 13 years of practice." He looked at me for a moment, then he nodded. We filed the following Monday. The press coverage began within 4 days. The initial stories were relatively contained. Legal filings are public record, but they require a journalist to care enough to read them, and the Whitfield name was well known enough locally to generate that care. By the end of the first week, it had gone regional. By the end of the second week, it had attracted the interest of a financial press outlet with national circulation, which ran a piece that was carefully factual and therefore, in its careful factuality, devastating. The headline didn't say anything inflammatory. It didn't need to. The facts of the complaint were inflammatory enough on their own. A dying man's expressed wishes, a destroyed will, a biological heir kept away from a deathbed. The story wrote itself, and the story was the one I'd been living for 13 years. Preston's PR operation responded within 24 hours. The statement was measured and professional and described the claims as without merit and deeply mischaracterizing the circumstances of a private family matter. It was the right statement to issue. It was also, I suspected, written with the particular careful neutrality of people who know the underlying facts and have been instructed to say as little as possible. I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize, 2 weeks after filing. When I answered, there was a pause, and then a voice I recognized immediately, despite not having heard it in 13 years. Preston said my name. I said nothing. He said, "I think we should talk. Before this goes further." I said I'd had my attorney's contact information on the filing documents, and that he was welcome to reach out to Dominic. He said he wasn't talking about lawyers. He said he was talking about talking. I said I wasn't interested in talking without counsel present. Another pause, longer, and then he said, carefully, with the flatness of someone managing a very precise internal state, that he wanted me to know that this was going to hurt his father's memory. I let that land. I let it sit in the air between us for several seconds. Then I said, "Preston, what hurt your father's memory was what you did with it." I hung up. The proceedings began formally on a Thursday morning. Dominic and I arrived at the courthouse 40 minutes early. I sat in a waiting room and drank bad coffee and reviewed notes I'd already reviewed 100 times, not because I needed to review them, but because having something specific to do with my hands kept the rest of my mind from going somewhere unproductive. Preston arrived with 2 attorneys and a third person I didn't recognize, who had the posture of a communication consultant. He was wearing the conservative suit and controlled expression of someone who has been extensively prepared. He glanced in my direction once in the hallway before we went into the courtroom. I looked at him for a moment. Not 3 seconds, less than that. Then I looked away. Dominic laid out our opening position with the unhurried precision of someone who knows exactly how much rope he needs and has coiled it perfectly. He described the DNA documentation, the destroyed will, the attorney's contemporaneous notes, the testimony of Jonathan Mercer as a first-hand witness to the conversation in which Charles had informed his son of his intentions. Preston's lead counsel, a senior litigator from one of the state's largest firms, the kind of person you hire when you have resources and are in serious trouble, countered with the standard position. The documented will was clear and filed and properly executed. The claims of a draft will were unsubstantiated and relied on the testimony of a single elderly attorney, with a 13-year gap between the events and his disclosure. And the DNA documentation proved biology, but not testamentary intent. It was a competent opening. It identified the real weaknesses in our case accurately. Dominic had anticipated every word of it. Jonathan Mercer testified on the fourth day of proceedings. He was 75 years old, and he walked to the stand with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who has thought about this walk for a long time and intends to make it without hurry. He had the appearance of someone who has been reduced by time to his essential qualities: the careful intelligence, the ethical weight, the specific gravity of a man who understands that he is here because he failed to do something he should have done and has decided it is not too late to do it now. Preston's attorneys cross-examined him for 3 hours. The strategy was credibility destruction, the standard approach when a witness's testimony cannot be refuted with countervailing evidence. They challenged the accuracy of his memory over a 13-year period. They suggested with careful professional neutrality that a man in his mid-70s with a health history that included a cancer diagnosis might have experienced some degree of cognitive drift in his recollection of events. They questioned why he had waited 13 years to disclose information he claimed to have found morally troubling. Jonathan answered each question in the same measured, deliberate voice he'd used on the phone the day he'd called me. He said his memory was specific because he had maintained contemporaneous written notes and had reviewed them many times over the intervening years. He said his health history was accurate, but irrelevant to the accuracy of records he had maintained in written form at the time. He said he had waited 13 years because he had convinced himself for 13 years that uncertainty about what he could prove was a sufficient reason for silence, and that he had eventually understood that this was wrong. He said that last part without any particular emotion, just the flat statement of a man accounting for himself. When Dominic asked him to describe the conversation in which Charles Whitfield had told Preston about the draft will, Jonathan spoke for 11 minutes without interruption. He described the location: Charles's private study, a Tuesday afternoon in late August. He described who was present: himself, Charles, Preston. He described Charles's physical state: weakened but cognitively clear, sitting in the chair behind his desk, which he described in specific detail, I have no reason to doubt. He described the letter that Charles had read aloud to Preston, not its full contents, but its substance: the acknowledgement of a son he hadn't claimed, the explanation of the draft will, the request for Preston's understanding, the expression of his intention to speak with me before he died. He described Preston's response. He said Preston had been very still. He said that after Charles finished speaking, Preston had asked, in a very controlled voice, several procedural questions about the timeline, about the formalization of the will, about whether this had been discussed with the estate attorneys. He said he had answered those questions. He said Charles had then said that he intended to contact me directly, that he did not want more time to pass without speaking to me, that he had made a mistake in the years he'd allowed to pass. He said that Preston had nodded, said he understood, and left the room. He said he had thought, at the time, that Preston had taken the information with remarkable composure. He said he now understood what that composure had been. The courtroom was very quiet when he finished. Preston testified on a Tuesday in the 5th month of proceedings. He was 31 years old, and he carried himself with the specific, controlled bearing of someone who has been extensively prepared for exactly this. He was direct, clear, and spoke with the kind of measured precision that signals both intelligence and preparation. He was, I recognized, very good at this. He acknowledged finding the documents in his father's study. He described it as accidental. He had been looking for the book. The envelope had been open on the desk. He had read it without initially understanding what he was looking at. He described the reaction as distressing and confusing. He said he had not known how to process the information and had not immediately known what to do with it. Dominic asked him what he had done with the draft will. Preston said he hadn't done anything with it. He said he'd left it where he found it. Dominic asked whether he'd retained a copy. Preston said he hadn't. Dominic asked whether he'd consulted an attorney in September of our senior year about the legal status of handwritten draft wills in our state. A pause. Short. Barely visible. But there. Preston said he might have had a general conversation with someone in that period. He said he'd been processing difficult information about his father's health and estate, and it was possible he'd sought some general information. Dominic introduced the email into evidence. Preston's lead counsel objected on several grounds, all of which were overruled. The email was dated September 14th of our senior year. It was from Preston's personal email address to an attorney who, discovery had established, was a family associate. Someone Preston had met through a family connection and had apparently decided it was a safer channel than an official consultation. The email asked, specifically and without ambiguity, about the enforceability of handwritten draft wills and the procedural requirements for a new will to supersede an existing filed will. Dominic read it aloud. Preston's face during the reading was the face of someone who has been preparing for the possibility of this moment for a long time and has decided that stillness is the only viable tool. He sat very still. His expression didn't change, but I was watching closely, and I saw the thing I'd been watching for. His right hand, which was resting flat on the table in front of him, pressed slightly harder against the surface. Just for a moment, just for the duration of Dominic's reading of the critical sentence. He pressed his hand against the table, and then he released it, and then it was just stillness again. That was the tell. Dominic asked why, if his discovery of the documents had been accidental and distressing and confusing, he had followed up with a specific legal inquiry about the enforceability of draft wills 2 weeks later. Preston said he'd been trying to understand his father's intentions. Dominic said, "Did your father not explain his intentions to you directly in the meeting with his attorney in late August?" Preston said his father had been on significant medication at that point, and that he'd had concerns about his father's capacity. Dominic asked whether he had ever conveyed those concerns to Charles's medical team, or to Jonathan Mercer, or to any official party. Preston said he hadn't felt it was his place. Dominic let that answer sit in the room for a moment. Then he said, "You felt it wasn't your place to raise concerns about your father's capacity to change his will, but you did feel it was your place to research the enforceability of the draft will that you found in his study. Is that accurate?" Preston's lead counsel objected. The judge overruled. Preston said, "I was processing a difficult situation." Dominic said, "Yes, I understand. No further questions." Caroline Davenport testified on a Thursday in the 7th month of proceedings. I hadn't spoken to her since the week after my graduation, nearly 14 years before she took the stand. She had reached out after the case was filed. A careful email, 2 paragraphs, the tone of someone who has been rehearsing something for a long time. She said she had wanted to come forward before and hadn't known how. She said she had things to say that the court needed to hear. I had thanked her, forwarded the email to Dominic, and gone back to case preparation. In the 7 months between her email and her testimony, I had spoken with her twice. Both calls were brief, professional, focused on the scope and content of what she'd be asked. I had kept my distance from her testimony in the specific way you keep distance from something that matters enough to contaminate if you handle it wrong. She walked into the courtroom, and I saw her for the first time in 14 years. She was 31 years old, and she had the particular quality of someone who has done significant interior work. A stillness and directness that people develop when they've spent serious time looking at difficult things. She looked at me for a moment when she passed the plaintiff's table, and I looked back, and there was a whole secondary conversation in that exchange that I wasn't going to allow myself to fully engage with until the proceedings were over. She sat down. She was administered the oath. Dominic began with background. her relationship to Preston and to me during high school, the timeline of events. She was precise. She didn't editorialize. She answered the questions asked and didn't reach for more, which is exactly the right behavior on a witness stand, and which told me she'd been extremely well prepared. She described the evening in November when she'd been at the Whitfield house. She described the sound from upstairs. She described moving to the foot of the stairs. She described hearing the name, my name, spoken in the way she'd described to me in the diner 2 years before, unprompted, addressed to no one in the room, the voice of a man having a private conversation with someone absent. Dominic asked her what she'd done with that information. She said she'd asked Preston about it. She said Preston had told her it was the medication, that his father sometimes confused names, that it meant nothing. Dominic asked her if she'd believed him. She said yes. He asked when she had stopped believing him. She said after reading the complaint when the case was filed. She said a specific sentence from the complaint had unlocked a memory she'd had without context. A sentence Preston had spoken to her in his car in November, a week before Charles died. Dominic asked her to describe that sentence. She recited it verbatim. The sentence about people not being equipped to handle certain kinds of information. The sentence about protection not being the same as lying. And then she added something she hadn't told me about in our earlier conversations. She said there had been a second part to that exchange, that she hadn't thought to mention before the case was filed, that she'd remembered only after reading the complaint and beginning to reassemble the conversation in its full context. She said that after Preston had said the sentence about protection, she had asked. She wasn't sure why, it was instinctive. She had asked him who specifically he was protecting, and Preston had said, "My father's peace of mind." The courtroom was very quiet. Dominic asked, "Not your father's peace of mind, your father's peace of mind. Did you register the possessive at the time?" She said no. She said she'd registered it now. He said, "Thank you, no further questions." Preston's lead counsel cross-examined her for 2.5 hours. The strategy was the same as with Jonathan Mercer: challenge the reliability of a 14-year-old memory, suggest reconstruction in hindsight, raise the possibility of motivated testimony from someone who had personal history with the plaintiff. On the personal history question, he was direct. He asked whether she and I had had a romantic relationship. She said no. He asked whether there had been what she'd describe as romantic interest between us in high school. She said, "I think we were both aware of the possibility of it." He asked whether she was aware that I had, by my own account in the complaint, considered our connection significant. She said, "I was aware of it then. I'm aware of it now." He asked whether she believed that awareness might color her willingness to testify favorably to my case. She was quiet for a moment. Not the pause of someone searching for an answer, the pause of someone deciding how honest to be. She said, "I was used. That's my testimony. I was used as a mechanism to create a specific outcome for a specific reason. I understand that more clearly than I would like to. My willingness to say so in this courtroom has everything to do with that, and nothing to do with any feelings I may or may not have about the plaintiff." He moved on. When Caroline finished testifying, she walked out of the witness stand and past the plaintiff's table without looking at me. In the hallway during the break, I found her near the window at the end of the corridor. She was looking out at the street below. I stood next to her and she said, without turning, that she was sorry she hadn't understood sooner. I said she hadn't done anything wrong. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's not entirely true, and I've had to learn to live with the part of it that is." I looked at her profile in the window light. I said, "We were both 17. She said, "Yes, but I was the one who had options and didn't take them. I didn't push back on that. She deserved to hold her own accounting without me negotiating it." We stood at the window until someone called us back in. The proceedings concluded their primary evidentiary phase 8 months in. The court took 2 months for deliberation. During those 2 months, I worked. I appeared in other proceedings, reviewed other files, met with other clients. I had dinner with my mother on a Sunday in the middle of those 2 months, and she made the kind of meal she makes when she wants to signal care without making a production of it. We talked for hours, not about the case, not about Charles Whitfield, not about any of the things we'd spent 17 years not talking about. We talked about small things, ordinary things, the texture of daily life. At the end of the evening, she stood in the doorway and put her hand on my arm and said she was proud of me. I drove home and sat in my apartment in the dark for a long time. I had been operating under sustained forward pressure for so long that the possibility of it ending was almost physically disorienting. The movement had organized me, had given shape to my days and justification to my choices and a direction to face when the weight of everything got too heavy. What happened when the movement stopped was a question I hadn't fully worked out an answer to. I thought about what Elijah had said years ago across the library table. The difference between building something and building armor. I thought about the fact that I was 31 years old and the most significant relationship I'd maintained for 13 years was the one with a grievance. I wasn't comfortable with that thought. I let it stay. The decision came on a Tuesday. I was in my office, reviewing a brief for an unrelated case when Dominic called. His voice had the particular quality of someone delivering news carefully. Not because the news was bad, but because he understood that the emotional weight of it wasn't his to characterize. He said the court had found in our favor. The DNA documentation established paternity. The circumstantial and testimonial evidence of document destruction was found sufficient to establish bad faith in the estate administration. The court recognized my status as a biological heir of Charles Whitfield and awarded me an equitable share of the estate, 31% of the current net value of the Whitfield Group and associated holdings, 31%. I sat in my office chair and looked at the wall for a long time. Dominic said my name twice. I said thank you. I said I'd call him back. I sat there. I thought about the hospital hallway, the clock on the wall, 2:07. I thought about my father in the photograph on the wall of a building I now partly owned, standing at a dedication ceremony with his arm raised slightly, his profile clear in the angled light. I called my mother. When she answered and heard my voice, she understood immediately. She said very quietly, "Okay." That was all. Just okay. The word of someone whose body has just released 13 years of held breath. We stayed on the phone for a long time without saying very much. 2 weeks after the decision was finalized, I received a request from Preston's attorney for a meeting to discuss the mechanics of the transfer, accounting, asset valuation, administrative logistics. I agreed to a meeting on a Friday afternoon at a neutral law firm. Preston and I had not spoken directly since the phone call he'd placed 2 weeks after I filed the case, the call where he'd suggested we should talk, and I'd told him to call my attorney. I won't tell you the meeting was dramatic because it wasn't. It was efficient and procedurally precise. Numbers, timelines, administrative steps. 2 sets of attorneys on opposite sides of a conference table, moving through an agenda with professional thoroughness. But there was a moment, halfway through the second hour, when there was a natural pause in the proceedings, a break while documents were being organized. And I looked across the table at Preston for the first time, without the mediation of a courtroom. He was 31 years old, and he was wearing the expensive, understated clothing of a man who had grown up in expensive, understated clothing. He was slightly thinner than I remembered. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at 17. He was looking at the documents in front of him with the expression of someone performing careful attention to something that isn't actually holding their attention. I thought about the parking lot, the 3 seconds of eye contact, a 17-year-old boy who had been terrified and had chosen the most damaging available instrument What I felt was not what I'd expected. I want to be completely honest about this. I'd imagined this moment, not obsessively, but in the distant, abstract way you imagine certain future events that you've been building toward. And in the imagining, there had always been something clarifying. A clean note. Victory or justice or the specific satisfaction of a long account finally settled. What I felt was grief. Not for myself, though there was some of that. Grief for the shape of everything. For a man who had died wanting to say something and hadn't found the time. For two people who shared a father and had been maneuvered into opposition before they'd had the chance to be anything else. For the 6 years of a genuine friendship that had preceded the parking lot, which were now neither recoverable nor separable from what came after. At the end of the meeting, as people were gathering papers, Preston said my name. I looked at him. He said, quietly, not for the room, in the voice of someone who has been holding a sentence for a long time, that he wanted me to know that he understood his father had wanted to reach me, that he knew that. He didn't explain. He didn't qualify it. He didn't offer anything else. He said those 2 sentences, and he picked up his files, and he left the room. I sat there for a moment after he was gone. I did not respond. I chose not to respond, because there was nothing I could say that wouldn't be either too much or too little. Because every version of a response I'd prepared over the years, in anger, in grief, in the cold middle-of-the-night accounting of what I was owed, was inadequate to the actual weight of those 2 sentences in that actual room. Because the man who had said them was my brother in a way that neither of us had asked for, and I didn't know what to do with that yet. And I suspected I might not know for a long time. The silence communicated something. I'm less certain whether what it communicated was what I actually meant. 3 months after the financial settlement was executed, the legal determination of my status as Charles Whitfield's son became part of the official public record. My name appeared for the first time, alongside his in a court filing, his son, in the flat legal language of a state court decision, in a database that would exist as long as databases exist. I read the line several times. There is a thing that happens when you receive something you've spent years building toward. A strange doubling, in which the thing itself is real and present and exactly what you said you wanted, and simultaneously you're aware of the distance between what you'd imagined it would feel like and what it actually feels like. The imagined version is always cleaner, always quieter, always more completely resolved. The real version is just a line in a document, and a man in a photograph who's been dead for 13 years, and an empty office with his furniture in it. I went back to work. I go into the Whitfield Group building twice a month for board meetings. The first time I walked into the executive floor, this was some weeks after the settlement, for an orientation meeting that had been scheduled with studied neutrality by both sets of attorneys. I arrived early. The receptionist showed me to a conference room. I had 20 minutes. I walked down the hallway and stood in the doorway of what had been Charles Whitfield's office, what is now Preston's office, and looked at it without going in. The room was organized in the way of a man who had inherited someone else's order and maintained it. The same furniture, I suspected, the wide desk, the windows, and on the wall, the photograph I'd heard about from Caroline, Charles at a dedication ceremony, his arm raised, his profile visible in angled light. I stood in the doorway and looked at the photograph for several minutes. The profile, the line from forehead to jaw. I have my mother's coloring and most of her features, but that profile, I got it from somewhere else. I heard footsteps behind me and turned. Preston was at the end of the hallway, his coat still on, having apparently just arrived. He saw me at the doorway of his office and stopped walking. We looked at each other. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then he walked past me into the office. I stepped back from the doorway. He set his briefcase on the desk and took off his coat and hung it on the back of the door. And every movement was the movement of a man performing ordinary routine because the alternative is having a conversation he doesn't know how to have. I said, without going in. He had good instincts about space, the windows work. Preston looked at me. I don't know why I said it. It wasn't quite an olive branch. It wasn't quite anything I can name. It was just something true about the room. He said after a moment, "Yes." Then the attorney for the meeting arrived, and we went down the hall to the conference room, and the moment was over. I've thought about that exchange many times since, about what it meant and what it didn't mean, about the specific, strange dynamic of two men in a building that belongs to both of them and to neither of them, navigating the distance between a shared inheritance and an unshared history. We speak to each other in the register of men who have business to conduct. It is functional and professional and completely, permanently strange. There is no warmth and there is no hostility, and the space between those two things is not neutral. It is charged with everything that can't be said in a conference room. I don't know what Preston carries. I have inferences and depositions and a set of observations about a man under pressure, and none of it tells me what he does with the knowledge of what he did, whether the weight of it sits on him heavily, or whether he has found mechanisms to manage it at a remove, whether he thinks about the 14 minutes, whether he thinks about his father saying my name in the dark. I don't ask. I won't ask. What I have is the public record, which says what it says, and the photograph on the wall of an office I walk past twice a month, and 31% of my father's life's work, which I use as leverage in the work of running a company that bears a name I share. These are the things I own. I want to end this story honestly, which means telling the part that doesn't resolve cleanly. I have 31% of the Whitfield Group. My name is in the public record. My father wanted me to have his name and a legal recognition of our relationship, and 13 years late and through mechanisms he would never have chosen, I have some version of both. The man who systematically engineered my separation from those things has spent a year and a half watching the consequences of his choices accumulate in public record. He has lost uncontested control of the business he inherited. He has had the architecture of his high school calculation laid out in precise detail in a court filing that will exist as long as court records are maintained. He continues to run the company. He's not incompetent, and the board recognized that removing him entirely would damage the operation, but he runs it with 31% of his authority shared with the person he spent 6 years trying to erase. By most reasonable measures, I won. I want to tell you what winning has done to me, more precisely what the long preparation for winning did. I am 31 years old, and I am constitutionally incapable of moderate investment. I give everything or I give nothing. I have 2 friendships that are genuinely deep, Elijah and one other person, and 10 that are careful and professional and not quite either. I am excellent at identifying threats and poor at identifying when a situation doesn't require threat management. I have a history of vacating relationships before they can ask the questions that would cost me something to answer. I have a father whose face I can see in a photograph in a building I partly own, and whose voice I have one memory of, a handshake at Christmas, a sentence about Preston speaking well of me, and that is the entire inventory of my paternal relationship. No legal decision changes the inventory. The inventory is the inventory. I know his name and his legacy and the shape of what he built, and I do not know the sound of him calling my name in an ordinary voice, in ordinary light, without the medication and the guilt and the closing time pressing in. I spent 13 years building towards something with extraordinary discipline. The discipline was real and the building was real, and I am genuinely proud of what I constructed. But I also spent 13 years allowing a particular kind of cold, sustained anger to organize my energy. The organizing was efficient. The anger was, by most reckonings, justified. I am not certain I can separate those years from myself cleanly enough to know what I would have been without them. Some nights I sit in my apartment and think about what a conversation would have looked like. Not the deathbed conversation I missed, which would have been grief and medication and the inadequacy of language at terminal moments, but an ordinary conversation. A Tuesday phone call, a Sunday dinner somewhere unremarkable. The kind of exchanges that accumulate over years into a relationship. A father and a son learning each other in the slow, ordinary way. I think about the word son and what it costs to have inherited it through a legal ruling instead of a voice. I think about Preston in his office, with money he has clear legal title to, and a story he carries privately. I watch people live with less ethical weight than that, and I know the mechanisms they use, and I don't find them convincing. I suspect he doesn't either. Caroline sent me a text 3 weeks after the decision was finalized. It said she hoped I was doing okay and that she meant it. I read it. Testimony. She responded, "That's not what I meant." I typed a response. I deleted the response. I put my phone down and went to bed. In the morning, I sent her a short message saying I appreciated her testimony. She responded, "That's not what I asked." I left that unread for 2 days. Then I wrote back. I told her I was okay in the ways that can be measured and less certain in the ways that can't. I told her that the thing I'd been building toward for 13 years was finished, and that I was still figuring out what that meant about what came next. I told her that sitting in the window with her in that courthouse hallway was the most honest moment I'd had in a very long time. She wrote back 3 hours later, a long message about what she'd been carrying, her own accounting, the specific texture of what it meant to have been used as a mechanism by someone she'd trusted. About the years after high school that she'd spent trying to understand what had happened without having the full picture. We've been talking since. I'm not going to tell you what that looks like yet, because I don't fully know, and because the honest truth is that I am 31 years old, and I am still learning how to be in a room without managing the exit. That is a slow kind of learning. It doesn't have a verdict. There's no deposition for it, no evidentiary record, no judge to rule on whether you've met the standard. You just show up again and try to be more present than you were before. I'm working on it. I drive home from those board meetings in the dark. Sometimes I sit in the parking lot of my building for a few minutes before going upstairs. Not 23 minutes, the way I once sat in a high school parking lot in October, unable to start the engine. Less than that. 5 minutes maybe. Just enough time to let the transition happen, from the person I am in that building to the person I am alone. From the partial owner of a legacy I arrived at through a court order to the man who has to decide what to do with the rest of the life that came after the winning. My father's name is on a legal document that also bears my name. The man himself has been gone for 13 years. I keep both of those facts. I do not know how to set one of them down. I'm not sure I'm supposed to. I look at the dark street outside my car window. I start the engine. I go upstairs. The work of the day is done. The work of everything else continues. Stories like this happen more than you think. Someone right now is sitting in silence, building something the people who underestimated them will never see coming. Subscribe. The next story is already waiting.